Think about the last time you changed your mind about something important, really changed it. Not just updated a small detail, but completely reversed a belief you held with confidence. Chances are it didn't happen because someone handed you a well reasoned argument with footnotes. And yet somehow, an idea you never asked for, something half formed, emotionally charged, maybe not even fully accurate, found its way into your head and stuck there like a splinter you can't quite reach. That's what this video is about. We're going to talk about why bad ideas spread faster than good ones, why some beliefs seem almost impossible to kill, and this is the part most people miss. There's one specific trait that makes an idea almost impossible to resist once it attaches to your identity. We'll get there. But first, you need to understand what's actually happening when an idea moves from one person to another, because it's not what most people think. Here's the thing most of us assume: ideas spread because they're useful, or true, or well argued. We like to think the best information wins, but the evidence says something very different. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. A landmark study out of MIT tracked over 126,000 news stories spreading across social media and found that false news travels farther, faster, deeper, and more broadly than the truth, and falsehoods were 70% more likely to be shared than accurate information, reaching 1,500 people about 6 times faster than the truth. That's troubling, but here's the part that will really bother you. The researchers found that false news spreads more quickly than the truth because humans, not robots, are more likely to spread it. So why? Why are we so reliably bad at this? The answer goes back further than social media, further than the internet, and starts with a biologist named Richard Dawkins. In 1976, Dawkins published a book called The Selfish Gene, and toward the end of it, he proposed something that most people at the time thought was a stretch. After establishing that genes as units of heritable information cause natural evolution, he stated that organisms are also subjected to cultural evolution, which works in a similar way. He suggested that ideas could be subject to Darwinian principles, since they appear to replicate through cultural transmission, the same way genes replicate through biological reproduction. He coined the term meme from the Greek mimema, meaning imitated, to describe this unit of cultural information. And he wasn't talking about funny images online. He meant any idea, tune, phrase, or belief that jumps from one mind to another. Here's the core insight. Dawkins conceived of memes as the cultural parallel to biological genes and considered them, in a manner similar to selfish genes, as being in control of their own reproduction and thus serving their own ends. Think about that for a second. The idea is doing the work. You're just the vehicle. Memes carry information, are replicated, and are transmitted from one person to another, and they have the ability to evolve, mutating at random, and undergoing natural selection, with or without impacts on human fitness. Dawkins said ideas work the same way. They replicate, they mutate as they travel from person to person, and they compete against each other for limited mental real estate. Since each brain has a limited capacity for memory, memes essentially compete to be remembered. A new form of evolution, cultural evolution. And just like biological evolution, this process doesn't care about quality, it only cares about survival. A virus doesn't need to be good for you to spread. It just needs to be contagious. That's the first thing you have to understand. Truth and contagiousness are completely different qualities, and the information environment rewards the second one, not the first. To really feel the weight of that, think about what it means for how you consume information every single day. You probably encounter dozens of claims before noon, in your feed, in a group chat, from someone at work, from a podcast playing in the background, and your brain is not running each of those through a careful fact-checking process. It can't. It's using shortcuts. It's asking, does this feel right? Does this match what I already believe? Does this seem like something worth passing along? Those shortcuts are not bugs in human cognition. They're features that evolved to help us process a world with too much information and not enough time. But they're features that contagious ideas have learned to exploit. The data from the MIT study supports a novelty hypothesis. False news was more novel than the truth, and people were more likely to share novel information. That's a crucial detail. It's not that people were trying to deceive anyone. They were sharing things that felt surprising, interesting, worth talking about. The inaccurate information just happened to be more surprising than the accurate information, so it won the competition, not because it was better, but because it was newer and more unexpected. Your brain is wired to pay attention to the unexpected. An idea that surprises you is an idea that gets passed along. So, what actually makes an idea contagious? There are 6 traits, and the most dangerous ones work below the level of conscious awareness. But there's one of them, the last one we'll cover, that changes everything about how ideas defend themselves once they're inside you. Keep that in mind. The first trait is simplicity. And I want to be clear about what simplicity actually does here, because it's not just about being easy to understand. Simple ideas are easy to repeat. And the easier something is to repeat, the more copies it makes of itself. A complex, nuanced position requires effort to transmit accurately. Every time it gets passed along, it loses detail, gets distorted, gets shortened. But a simple idea: vaccines cause harm, immigrants take jobs, Russia hoax, those travel intact. They survive the journey from mouth to ear without mutation. Nuance slows transmission. Certainty accelerates it. That's not a political statement, it's a mechanical one. Simple ideas replicate faster because they're easier to copy. Think about this in terms of something like a telephone game. You've probably played it as a kid. You whisper a sentence down a line of people, and by the end, it's completely different from what you started with. Now imagine you're playing that game with a complicated multi-part argument about monetary policy versus a single punchy sentence. The complicated argument arrives at the other end unrecognizable. The punchy sentence arrives almost perfectly intact. That's not a metaphor for how ideas spread. That literally is how ideas spread. Every conversation, every share, every retelling is a step in that telephone game. The ideas that survive are the ones simple enough to copy without distortion. This is also why slogans outlast speeches. A political speech can be 45 minutes of nuanced policy discussion, and what gets remembered is the 3-word phrase from the last 30 seconds. The phrase is easy to repeat, so it replicates. The nuanced policy discussion is hard to repeat accurately, so it dies in transmission. Advertisers figured this out a long time ago. You don't remember the detailed claims in a car commercial. You remember the jingle, the tagline, the feeling. The simple thing survives. The next trait is emotion, and this one is backed by a mountain of research. The novelty of false news inspired replies expressing greater surprise, fear, and disgust. And emotional content doesn't just get shared more, it gets processed differently. Daniel Kahneman's work on fast and slow thinking explains part of this. When something triggers a strong emotion, your brain's fast system takes over. You react before you evaluate. You share before you verify. The emotional spike essentially bypasses the critical filter. Kahneman described 2 systems of thought: System 1, which is fast, automatic, and emotional, and System 2, which is slow, deliberate, and analytical. The problem is that System 2 is expensive. It takes effort and energy. Your brain defaults to System 1 whenever it can, and emotionally charged information is one of the things that locks System 1 in place and prevents System 2 from engaging. So when you feel a surge of anger or fear or moral outrage at something you just read, that feeling is not a signal that the information is important. It's often a signal that your critical thinking has been bypassed. The emotion and the accuracy are separate things, and the emotion arrived first. Research shows that anger spreads faster and farther than almost anything else online. One study found that anger is more contagious than joy. So ideas that make you angry or scared or morally outraged have a built-in competitive advantage. They're not better ideas. They're just louder ones. And the louder an idea is, the more copies it makes of itself before anyone stops to ask whether it's true. There's a reason political content, outrage news, and moral panic stories consistently outperform calm, informative reporting in engagement metrics. It's not because people are irrational, it's because the emotional response is a feature of the idea. And that feature is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It's making copies of itself. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Emotion and simplicity together are powerful, but they're not the most powerful combination. That comes when you add the third trait, identity. And this is the one I told you to watch for. Because once an idea becomes part of how someone sees themselves, once it stops being a belief they hold and starts being a signal of who they are, something changes. Dawkins himself noted that meme evolution doesn't always work in harmony with human benefit. A belief might be of no benefit whatsoever to the believer, or even counterproductive, and yet it persists. Why? Because people don't defend ideas on the basis of evidence. They defend them on the basis of belonging. Think about how this plays out. Someone adopts a political belief, a dietary philosophy, a religious framework, a brand loyalty. At first, it's just an opinion. But over time, it becomes a marker of their tribe. And once that happens, any challenge to the idea feels like a personal attack. Changing their mind doesn't just mean updating a belief. It means potentially losing their community, their identity, their sense of self. So they don't change their mind, they dig in. The idea has essentially built a wall around itself using the human need for belonging as the bricks. Carl Jung wrote about the concept of the collective unconscious, the idea that humans share deep, inherited psychological structures that shape how we perceive and our sense of belonging. You don't need to accept the full Jungian framework to see the pattern it's pointing at. Humans are not primarily rational individuals making independent judgments. We are social animals who derive our sense of reality from the groups we belong to. Our beliefs are partly about what's true and partly about who we are. And that second part, the identity part, is where ideas become almost impossible to dislodge. This is why you can show someone accurate evidence that contradicts a belief they hold deeply and watch them walk away more convinced than before. Psychologists call it the backfire effect. The correction doesn't weaken the idea, it strengthens it, because now the person feels attacked and rallies to defend the belief even harder. The idea survives not because it's true, but because it's become part of who someone is. You see this in brand loyalty too, and it's worth noticing because it strips away the political charge and shows you the pure mechanism. There are people who will argue passionately that their preferred laptop brand, their phone manufacturer, their car company makes objectively superior products. And they will argue this even when the specs don't support it, because at some point the brand stopped being a product they bought and became a part of how they see themselves. Apple person, Android person. These aren't just consumer preferences, they're identity signals. And once something becomes an identity signal, logic stops being the operating system and belonging becomes the operating system instead. The fourth trait is repetition, and it works in a way that's almost embarrassingly simple. The more times you hear something, the more familiar it feels. And the more familiar something feels, the more true it seems. Psychologists call this the illusory truth effect. Repeated exposure to a claim increases perceived credibility, even when the claim is false, and even when people were initially skeptical of it. Advertisers figured this out decades ago. Politicians love this technique. Propagandists have known it for centuries. Repetition doesn't need to be clever. It just needs to be consistent. What's particularly unsettling about the illusory truth effect is that familiarity and truth feel almost identical in the brain. When you hear something and it processes smoothly, when there's no friction, no sense of effort, your brain interprets that fluency as a signal of accuracy. You've heard it before, so it goes down easy. So it must be right. That's the mechanism. And it means that the most repeated idea in your environment, regardless of its accuracy, has a structural advantage over a less repeated but more accurate one. Frequency is a form of persuasion, not because anyone decided it should be, just because of how memory and familiarity work together in the brain. The fifth trait is imitation. Richard Dawkins coined the word meme by adapting it from the Greek word mimeme, which means imitate. He thought memes jump from brain to brain by being copied into different people's minds. Humans are extraordinarily good at copying behavior and belief. We look to the people around us to figure out what's normal, what's acceptable, what's true. If everyone in your social circle believes something, the cognitive cost of disbelieving it is enormous. You're not just disagreeing with an idea, you're disagreeing with your entire reference group. So imitation keeps ideas alive even when they've lost their original logic. You believe it partly because everyone around you believes it, and they believe it partly because everyone around them believes it. This is especially worth thinking about in the context of how we form beliefs in early life. Most of what you believe about the world, about how relationships work, about what success looks like, about which groups of people are trustworthy and which aren't, you didn't arrive at through careful, independent reasoning. You absorbed it from the people around you, your family, your community, your school, your media environment. Imitation was the mechanism. The ideas didn't need to prove themselves to you. They just needed to be everywhere you looked, and your brain did the rest. That's not a criticism of anyone. It's just how social learning works. The problem is when we forget that's how it happened and start treating those absorbed beliefs as though we reasoned our way to them independently. Which brings us to the sixth trait, social proof. This is the amplified version of imitation. Social proof is when the visibility of an idea, how many people seem to hold it, how loudly they hold it, how publicly, becomes evidence for its validity. Humans are wired to interpret popularity as a signal of quality. If 1,000 people are sharing something, it must be worth sharing. If 1,000,000 people believe something, there must be something to it. This was useful when we were small groups relying on collective wisdom to navigate an uncertain world. In an information environment where visibility is determined by algorithms optimizing for engagement, it becomes a liability. The thing about social proof is that it creates a self-reinforcing loop. An idea gets shared a lot, so more people see it, so more people assume it must be valid, so more people share it, so even more people see it. The idea isn't getting more accurate as it spreads, it's just getting more visible, and visibility is being interpreted as validity. At a small scale, this is manageable. At the scale of modern social media platforms with billions of users, it becomes the primary engine of how beliefs form and shift in entire populations. And that brings us to the environment itself, because this is where everything accelerates. The data supports a novelty hypothesis. False news was more novel than the truth, and people were more likely to share novel information. But novelty alone doesn't explain the full picture. The platforms themselves changed the selection environment for ideas in a way that has no historical precedent. Algorithms are at the core of platforms like YouTube, TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram, and they modify what gets shown to users based on engagement, typically promoting emotionally provocative or controversial material, creating feedback loops that amplify polarizing narratives. Think about what that means in terms of idea evolution. The environment has changed. And when the environment changes, what survives changes with it. In the biological world, if the climate suddenly gets colder, the animals with thicker fur survive and reproduce more. The environment selects for that trait. Social media platforms have created an environment that selects for emotional intensity, novelty, and tribal signaling. It doesn't matter whether the content is helpful, harmful, accurate, or misleading. All the algorithm sees is activity, and activity gets rewarded with wider reach. Here's a way to think about the scale of this. Before the internet, an idea had to travel through physical social networks. Word of mouth, newspapers, books, television, each of those channels had friction. Editors, publishers, broadcast licenses, the simple limitation of how many people you could talk to in a day. That friction wasn't always good. It could suppress important ideas too, but it also slowed the spread of low-quality, emotionally manipulative ideas. It gave communities time to evaluate claims before they became widely accepted. Social media removed most of that friction almost overnight. And what rushed in to fill the gap were the ideas best suited to the new frictionless environment, which, for the reasons we've covered, tend to be the simple, emotionally charged, identity linked ones. So calm, nuanced, accurate ideas, the ones that require some effort to understand, get filtered out. Not because anyone decided to suppress them, just because they don't generate enough engagement to survive. The algorithm isn't malicious, it's just optimizing for the wrong thing. And the ideas that thrive in that environment are the ones with the most emotional charge, the clearest tribal signal, the most satisfying certainty. The bad ideas aren't winning because people are stupid, they're winning because the environment was built to select for them. It's worth noting that this dynamic doesn't just affect politics or news, it affects science communication, health information, financial advice, parenting beliefs, relationship norms. Every domain where ideas compete for attention is subject to the same selection pressure. The emotional, simple, identity linked claim about what causes illness, or how to raise children, or what makes a relationship work will spread farther than the careful, nuanced, evidence based one. Not because the careful one is wrong, but because the careful one is harder to copy and less emotionally engaging. This is one of the most important problems in how modern societies form shared beliefs, and most people have no framework for understanding it because no one ever explained to them that ideas compete the way organisms compete. Now, here's the halfway point, and I want to remind you of something. We started by asking why bad ideas spread faster than good ones. We've covered the mechanics, the six traits, the evolutionary framing, the algorithmic environment. But there's still the most important question: what do you actually do about it? Both for ideas you want to spread and for ideas you want to stop spreading through you. Let's start with spreading worthwhile ideas, because most people get this wrong in a very specific way. They assume that the quality of an idea is enough. If it's true and useful, it'll spread on its own. But you've seen why that's not how it works. Truth doesn't have a built-in advantage. Contagiousness does. So if you have a genuinely good idea in your business, your leadership, your creative work, your relationships, you need to give it the traits that help it travel. Make it simple first, not dumbed down, but compressed. A good idea expressed in one clear sentence will always outlast a good idea buried in a paragraph. Find the core of what you're saying and strip everything else away. This is harder than it sounds. Most people, when they understand something deeply, want to communicate all of it, every caveat, every qualification, every layer of nuance. And that impulse comes from a good place, but it works against transmission. The person you're talking to doesn't need the full picture right now. They need the seed. Give them the seed first, and the full picture can come later if they're interested. The seed is what travels. Then attach it to something emotional, not manufactured outrage that backfires, but genuine stakes. What does this idea mean for the person in front of you? What do they stand to gain or lose? Emotion isn't manipulation. It's relevance made visceral. When you make someone feel why something matters before you explain what it is, you've already cleared the biggest obstacle to transmission. They're now carrying the idea with energy behind it, not just information. Then give people a way to identify with it. The law of diffusion of innovation, developed by Everett Rogers, describes how ideas move through populations. And the key insight is that early adopters don't spread ideas because they're convinced by logic. They spread them because adoption signals something about who they are. If your idea can become a badge of identity for the right people, those people will do the spreading for you. Think about how this worked with something like the environmental movement or the early personal computer movement or any number of professional identities built around a set of ideas. The people who spread those ideas weren't primarily motivated by the content of the ideas. They were motivated by what adopting those ideas said about them. That's not cynical. It's just how human social signaling works. And if your idea is genuinely good, there's nothing wrong with understanding the mechanism that will actually move it through the world, and use repetition without apology. Say the same core message in different ways across different contexts. Familiarity builds trust. Consistency builds credibility. The temptation when you're communicating something important is to keep finding new ways to say it because you're bored of the original phrasing. But your audience hasn't heard it as many times as you have. What feels repetitive to you feels consistent to them. The idea needs to appear in enough places and enough conversations to trigger the illusory truth effect in your favor rather than against you. Now, for the harder part, protecting your own mind. Because the same traits that make ideas contagious also make them manipulative. And the scariest thing about a highly contagious idea is that you often don't notice it's taken hold until it's already shaping how you see everything. There are 4 questions worth asking whenever you find yourself strongly attached to a belief, especially one that arrived quickly and feels obvious. First, where did I actually encounter this idea? Was it from a single source or multiple independent sources? Was it in a context designed to provoke a reaction? This matters because the source tells you something about the selection pressure the idea went through before it reached you. An idea that came to you through a single viral post went through very different filtering than an idea that came to you through multiple independent sources who had no reason to coordinate. The former might be accurate, but you have much less evidence for it than the feeling of certainty suggests. Second, what emotion does this idea trigger in me? Strong emotions, especially anger, fear, or moral outrage, are a signal to slow down, not speed up. They're often the mechanism by which an idea bypasses your critical thinking, not evidence that the idea is correct. This is genuinely hard to apply in practice because the emotion arrives before the evaluation. By the time you're feeling angry or scared, the idea has already been processed by System 1 and stamped with a sense of certainty. Applying this question requires catching yourself after the fact, noticing the emotion, and then deliberately asking whether it's telling you something about the quality of the idea or just about how effectively the idea was packaged. Third, who benefits if I repeat this? Every idea has someone behind it. Sometimes that's benign, sometimes it's not. Asking who gains from the spread of this belief is one of the most clarifying questions you can ask. When you trace an idea back to its origin and ask who funded it, who amplified it, who benefits when large numbers of people believe it, you often find that the answer changes how you feel about the idea itself. This doesn't mean every idea with a motivated party behind it is wrong, but it means you should be applying more scrutiny, not less. And fourth, this is the one most people avoid. What evidence would actually change my mind? If you can't answer that question, if no possible evidence would shift your belief, that's not confidence. That's the idea defending itself using your identity as a shield. A genuine belief held for genuine reasons should be falsifiable. You should be able to say, if I saw X, I would update my view. If you can't say that, if the belief is structured so that any contradicting evidence just confirms the conspiracy or gets dismissed as coming from the wrong source, then the idea has achieved something close to immunity. And that immunity isn't a sign of strength. It's a sign that the idea has merged with your identity so completely that you can no longer evaluate it separately from yourself. These 4 questions won't make you immune. Nothing will. But they create a gap between the idea arriving and you acting on it, and that gap is where your actual judgment lives. The goal isn't to become a skeptic who trusts nothing. The goal is to become someone who notices when an idea is doing something to them, rather than just being carried along by it. That noticing is the whole ballgame, because the ideas that are most dangerous to your thinking are never the ones that feel suspicious. They're the ones that feel obvious. Here's what we've covered. Ideas don't just spread because they're good. They spread because they're simple, emotional, identity-linked, repeated, imitated, and socially validated. Memes carry information, are replicated, and are transmitted from one person to another, with the ability to evolve, mutating at random and undergoing natural selection. That's a true evolutionary process, and it's been running in human culture for as long as we've been able to talk. Social media didn't invent it. It just turbocharged it by building an environment that selects for emotional intensity over accuracy. The reason this framework matters, the reason it's worth understanding at this level of detail, is that it changes what you do next. If you think bad ideas spread because people are gullible, the only solution is to make people smarter, and that's a slow and uncertain project. But if you understand that bad ideas spread because the environment selects for contagiousness over truth, you can start doing something about the environment, both the external one and the internal one. You can choose what you amplify. You can pause before you share. You can ask the four questions. You can design your own communication to give good ideas the traits they need to compete. None of that requires you to be smarter than everyone else. It just requires you to understand the game that's being played. The thing that changed from the beginning of this video to now is the frame. You came in thinking about ideas as things you choose. But ideas are also things that choose you, or more precisely, things that compete to survive inside you, using your psychology as the battlefield. Understanding that doesn't make you cynical. It makes you a more careful thinker, a more effective communicator, and a harder target for the ideas that spread, not because they're true, but because they're contagious. If this made you think differently about something you believe right now, drop it in the comments. I'm genuinely curious what came up for you. And if you want to go deeper on how persuasion actually works, the psychology behind why we're convinced by certain people and not others, that video is right here. It connects directly to everything we just talked about, and I think you'll find it changes how you see influence entirely. Thanks for watching. If you liked learning about patterns, such as contagious ideas, then make sure to like this video and click the subscribe button. We publish video essays every week on hidden systems that have huge impacts on our world.